The British far right is imploding, and it's kind of Elon Musk's fault. Some of you might remember a good, maybe 3 months ago now, Elon Musk had this kind of temporary obsession with British politics. I think what had happened is the US election had come and gone. He was high on the fumes of Trump winning, and he'd decided that he was quite keen to see similar electoral results happen elsewhere. He threw himself behind the AfD in Germany, and he threw himself behind the Reform Party in the UK. In fact, there was a rumour for a while that he was set to donate... Yeah, the figure that was floated around was $100 million that he was potentially going to donate to the Reform Party. And whether or not this was ever actually going to happen is a bit of a question mark. It got reported on a whole load. People speculated about it for ages. Once it was being reported on in the news, he did kind of respond and was like, yeah, I'm thinking about this. There was a lot of debate about whether it should be allowed to happen, right? Should the richest man in the world who is not British be able to influence a British election by donating what is a huge amount of money for British politics to reform, right? 'Cause, in the US, this kind of donation is maybe, I mean, I imagine it's still out there, but, US elections are huge spending sprees. How much did Kamala Harris spend on the campaign? $1.5 billion in 15 weeks. In the UK, we do have some spending limits on political campaigning, both for local candidates and for parties as a whole. And so it's not really... there's a limit to how much money it is useful to have, even. But the donation itself never happened. In fact, eventually, Elon Musk's attention got drawn to Germany and now seems to have waned a little bit. I guess doing the whole Doge thing has presumably taken some of his time, right? But there was a brief exchange in the midst of that obsession, which I remember catching my eye at the time, but which has come to have quite significant consequences for the Reform Party that Elon Musk was so keen to see a win. On the one level, this is a story about some politicians having a disagreement, but through the medium of kind of children fighting, it's really just the tone of it is great. Partway through Elon Musk's fascination with British politics, he initially was all behind Nigel Farage, who is pretty good friends with Trump. Farage has often gone over to the US to campaign with Trump. Lots of photos together. They clearly see themselves as fellow travellers. But then Musk got really interested in Tommy Robinson, who if Nigel Farage is pretty far right, Tommy Robinson is like a street fighting far right football hooligan who is currently in prison, but for some parts of the kind of very, very far right in the UK, has always been a bit of a cause célèbre. And so Musk had tweeted out support for freeing him from prison, labelling him someone who had been silenced and all this. And Nigel Farage was like, no, actually, that guy is too far right even for me, right? He is beyond the pale far right. Nigel Farage was like, no, I'm trying to be, yes, a hard right politician, but, one that is presentable and acceptable, ... And so then Elon Musk sort of turned on him a little bit and was like, no, the Reform Party needs a new leader. Farage doesn't have what it takes. And then, and just to clarify how quickly this happened, so Musk turned on Farage at 1:58 p.m. And then, slightly under 2 hours later, what seems to have happened is someone else on what is like an anonymous, potentially bot, possibly British, but who knows, account, had tweeted about this guy called Rupert Low taking over as leader of the Reform Party instead of Nigel Farage. And Elon Musk, on what I can only assume was just a whim of like wanting to hit out at Farage and this being the first thing he saw, was like, I've not met Rupert Low, but his statements online that I have read so far make a lot of sense. Which was seen by many kind of as Elon Musk throwing his weight behind Rupert Low taking over as leader of Reform. Which, for anyone who's watching this that is not in the UK, the ludicrousness of this as a strategy is so extreme, right? Love him or hate him, Nigel Farage is the most successful British politician of the 21st century. Not in any traditional sense of that word, right? He has lost more elections than, you know, you've had hot dinners. He's stood so many times and, you know, not come away with the position. When he has served, he's broadly served as like a member of European Parliament, which isn't like the most high profile of jobs in UK politics. Of course, we don't have members of European Parliament anymore because the thing that he has campaigned for, which was for Britain to leave the EU, happened, right? There's an old saying about, you know, in life you can either be an elephant that has a fly landing on you and you're trying to swat off this tiny fly, or you can be the fly that is kind of making the elephant dance. Nigel Farage, for most of his career, has very much not been the elephant, but he has been the fly that has made British politics dance. For decades, he has campaigned for Britain to leave the European Union and for immigration to go down. And even though he might not have won a load of elections, he has very much got his own way. And it is at this point looking like he might be the next Prime Minister, very possibly. In comparison to Nigel Farage, Rupert Low is a guy. Like, if you went to most high streets in the UK, Nigel Farage would struggle to walk down that high street because some people would massively disagree with him and would want to shout abuse at him, and lots of people would want to go up and shake his hand. All of those people would be able to see him the other side of the street and cross over to go to talk to him and either hurl abuse or shake his hand. Rupert Low, you could walk into a pub with Rupert Low and no one would notice, and then you'd say, "Hey everyone, meet Rupert Low," and they'd all look confused. And then you'd go, "Rupert Low of the Reform Party," and then everyone would wait a minute, and then they'd go, "Oh, Nigel Farage's party." So kind of tactically, Elon Musk's suggestion that some guy replaced the most successful politician of the 21st century in the UK was ludicrous. And Rupert Low kind of passed off the suggestion. He responded a little later, so more awareness has been raised around, there was the particular issue that Elon Musk was kind of incensed by were series of grooming gangs and cases around that, which Rupert Low has a particularly he sort of likes to use those horrible cases, which happen to involve Pakistani men. He sort of likes to use those as the vector for why we should kick out all the immigrants. He was a little bit more sympathetic to throwing some light on Tommy Robinson. But he did say Tommy Robinson's role in exposing these gangs should be acknowledged. He is not right for reform. Then he said, I thank Elon for his kind comments. I just want to do what is right for my constituency and country. And then he sort of clarified, Nigel is leader of reform. He made Brexit happen. For that, I'll always be grateful. Look forward to working with Nigel, etc., etc. This was back in January. You would assume case closed. Done. Water under the bridge. What a fun little tussle. That is something which will never come up again. So it seemed like all of this was done and dusted under the bridge, right? I mean, it is worth saying that Nigel Farage and Rupert Low have some political differences as well. Rupert Low is quite a lot more extreme in his far-right politics than even Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage currently has been playing a game in which he has been trying to soften the image of the Reform Party a little bit. My assumption on this is that the Reform Party are currently polling incredibly well. So this poll from just under a week ago has the Reform Party at 25%, Labour's 26%. I've seen multiple polls from multiple different organisations which have had them ahead, which doesn't necessarily mean that that Nigel Farage will become Prime Minister and they'll sort of win the election in that sense, but it does look like they are going to do potentially quite well. My assumption on this is that Nigel Farage assumes that they've kind of got the far-right vote tied up, and therefore the bit of the vote that they need to target is this 21% of people who are still going to vote Conservative. Rupert Low has no such qualms. There was a story, I think this was in the Telegraph, I want to say earlier today, which led with the headline, Foreigners Convicted of Nearly a Quarter of Sex Crimes. Worth saying, not true. That's not what the data says. But it was based on a kind of right-wing think tank story, which muddied the data a little bit. And, you know, he's just, every single one of these foreign criminals needs to be deported, do what needs to be done. If that means a plane leaving every hour, good, I say clear the runway. Right, so that's the kind of politics we're looking at here with Rupert Low. But anyhow, they seemed to be trucking along kind of okay. That is until the 6th of March. So about 5 days ago, when Rupert Low, potentially with the memory of him being spotlighted by Elon Musk, gave an interview to Andrew Pierce at the Daily Mail, everyone's favourite reputable newspaper. And he talked about all kinds of topics, but eventually the topic came up of those exchanges with Elon Musk. And Andrew Pierce said, you know, does Low think that Farage would make a good PM? And his response was this. It's too early to know whether Nigel will deliver the goods, he replies carefully. He can only deliver if he surrounds himself with the right people. Nigel is a fiercely independent individual and is extremely good at what we have done so far. He has got messianic qualities. Will those messianic qualities distill into sage leadership? I don't know. He then continued, we have to change from being a protest party led by the Messiah, Nigel Farage there, into being a properly structured party with a front bench, which we don't have. We have to start behaving as if we are leading and not merely protesting. Then continued with this Nigel Farage as Jesus metaphor. Nigel is a messianic figure who is at the core of everything, but he has to learn to delegate, as not everything can go through one person. So we have to start developing policy which is going to change the way we govern. I'm not going to be by Nigel's side at the next election unless we have a proper plan to change the way we govern from top to bottom. We can't raise the hopes of people who are so frustrated with the way we are governed and then flunk it. Rupert Low there talking a little bit about how Nigel Farage is this messianic figure. I will say I didn't think that was super duper kind of rude and confrontational. Maybe the fact that he says it like 3 or 4 times possibly pushes it over the edge. But I thought it didn't sound too confrontational. Didn't sound too much like he was going to try and take over the party. But when he talks about Nigel Farage being, you know, this messianic figure, that he's at the centre of the party, that everything has to go through him, that is kind of true. So Reform, one of the big sort of criticisms that people have thrown at the Reform Party is that it remains, at the moment, a limited company. So most political parties in the UK, I think I'm right in saying, are kind of community organizations. They're kind of like, they have, you know, big constitutions which set out how they should work, that when you become a member of the political party, I guess you have like a literal stake in that party as an organization, and the constitution clearly states sort of how leaders get elected and how policy gets set sometimes and all of this kind of stuff. The Reform Party does none of that. It is a limited company, of whom the current directors are Nigel Paul Farage. I didn't know that. That's the first time I've come across that. And Richard Tice. Richard Tice was the leader of the Reform Party for quite a while. Then he got replaced. But basically, they get to decide who the leader is. They don't have to hold a vote of the members. So back in June 2024, just before the last general election here in the UK, Richard Tice had been the leader for quite some time, and effectively, just one day, they went, not anymore, it's Nigel Farage again. And they just sort of got to make that decision. They didn't have to hold a leadership election or the sort of thing that you might expect from a political party.
And today, his grin confirmed Rishi Sunak's worst nightmare.
Difficult though it is, I can't let down those millions of people. I simply can't do it. It'd be wrong. So I have decided, I've changed my mind.
Like, he just decided he was going to be leader of Reform again, and it just happened. But not only does the party have that structure, like, that is also a fair representation of Reform's perception in people's minds within the UK. You know, I joked earlier about Elon Musk suggesting that Rupert Low should take over, that everyone in the country knows who Nigel Farage is. Like, there will be there will be Reform Party, members who don't know who Rupert Low is. And they've sort of struggled to find anyone else who can get that kind of platform. Like, it sort of is, it's not entirely a cult of personality. Possibly in the same way that Trumpism maybe feels on the ground in the US, that maybe we don't see from other countries, that a lot of the support that Reform has is a result of kind of disenfranchisement with the system, economic concerns, fears about immigration, like that kind of stuff that's kind of hanging around. And therefore people have kind of drawn to Reform because of that broader stuff. But the sort of positive offer of Reform is Nigel Farage, effectively. As things stood, the party had 5 members of Parliament. Richard Tice, Nigel Farage. Lee Anderson has a little bit of a profile. He was formerly a member of the Conservative Party and defected in 2024. So just before the last general election. And so he's got a reasonable amount of profile because of that, because that was obviously a big news story. He was their first MP. They have 5 MPs. Nigel Farage, though, head and shoulders above the rest in terms of visibility, popularity. Rupert Low gives this interview on the 5th of March. A day later, this news story hits.
Allegations of serious bullying have been made against the Reform UK MP Rupert Low. The party says it's received complaints from 2 women who worked in his offices. The MP says the claims are untrue and said there is 0 credible evidence. Well, the party has released a statement saying evidence was provided to us of workplace bullying, the targeting of female staff who raised concerns, and evidence of derogatory and discriminatory remarks made about women, including reference to a perceived disability. We feel we have a duty of care to all our staff, whether employed directly or indirectly. Accordingly, we appointed an independent King's Counsel to conduct an investigation into the veracity of these complaints. To date, Mr. Low has yet to cooperate with this investigation. Our political correspondent.
Okay, so to clarify, a day after he gives an interview to the Daily Mail, which is one of the sort of house newspapers of the British far right, in which he's, you know, a little bit critical of Nigel Farage. He is suspended from the party, so he's had the whip withdrawn, which in kind of British political lingo means that within Parliament you're no longer technically a MP of your party, you're an independent. And not only have they withdrawn the whip, they've kind of laid out quite a few separate allegations. So the allegations are of bullying, of threats, violent threats is the language that Sky News uses here, against the party's chair. There was also an accusation that in Parliament he had pushed the shoulder of another MP. And they've withdrawn the whip. They've also engaged a King's Counsel, so that's sort of a lawyer, for want of a better term, to conduct an investigation. And also, I'm fairly sure, reported him to the police as well. So they went from nothing to like kind of everything, with multiple allegations, but also multiple ways of actioning those investigations. And so they've absolutely just kind of turned a shotgun on him. One thing that it is absolutely worth saying is that this is not to say that none of these allegations are true. They are, of course, still allegations. Both that investigation and the police investigation, etc., are ongoing. Rupert Low, however, has, perhaps naturally, questioned the timing of it all. So Rupert Low, of course, has kind of come out swinging. It's worth saying that potentially one of the reasons that Elon Musk likes Rupert Low is that this guy fucking adores Twitter. This guy just tweets all day long. In fact, one wonders whether his decision to take a swing at the king, as it were, is built off the fact that, judging by tweets alone, you would assume that this guy was endlessly popular. You know, business as usual, he tweets earlier today with, like, the lamest boomer meme of a guy cycling and then a thin, skinny guy cycling and then a kind of chunky government guy on the back. That got 14,000 likes. So yeah, he has been hitting back on this like all of the time on Twitter, right? You know, retweeting stuff about how he hosted a Reform donor dinner just hours before being thrown under the bus with the police probe. Retweeting people that are kind of pleading his case. Sophie Corcoran, who is a young woman who is a kind of right-wing influencer in the UK, saying, here we go, no bullying by Low. There is bullying in this situation, but it's coming from those weaponizing their position of power in order to drag a man's name through the mud. Like, this guy is posting through it. Day 11 of repeatedly asking to see any credible evidence against me. I've just been informed by a reliable source that senior Reform figures have been briefing journalists that I have dementia. In politics, there is rough and tumble. I get that, but this is sick. What they are doing to me is disgusting. Ever since this malicious attack on my reputation was launched, all I've asked for from both Reform and the KC is credible evidence against me. None of that has been provided. The KC has said she has been chasing for that. I have received nothing because there is no credible evidence against me. Like, usually when an investigation of a politician takes place, the thing that happens is that everyone goes, I will respect the process and I will be quiet about it until the investigation has happened. And usually that happens, like, whether or not the person sort of feels like it's unnecessary. You know, you kind of go, well, I'll let it happen and I will be vindicated. Rupert Low is having none of that. His position is very much that this is all nonsense and he is, you know, it's a witch hunt is the word he's used. In fact, what happened this weekend was kind of fascinating. This Sunday, Rupert Low published an article, a kind of think piece, op-ed, in the Sunday Telegraph, in which, you know, he claimed, I'm the victim of a witch hunt and I'm innocent. You know, is it a surprise that allegations about me were made public the day after I made reasonable criticisms of Nigel Farage? You know, again, very clear that he is completely innocent, and, you know, as he says here, it is a witch hunt. It's a witch hunt plain for all to see. I've been entirely frozen out of the Reform machine over the last few months in a deliberate and calculated way. What happened on the very same day, in quite a coup for this particular newspaper, is the Sunday Times also published a think piece from Nigel Farage, in which he sort of said, you know, Reform has acted responsibly over Rupert Low. You know, all of this is above board. He's kind of quite clear that he doesn't wish to see the Reform Party engaged in a civil war. I guess tough at this case. And kind of making it clear that he thinks that proper kind of processes have been followed. You know, he outlines one of the altercations that has been part of this. And so this on one day, which if you're a reader of the Sunday Telegraph, you're probably one of the few people who does know who Rupert Low is. If Nigel Farage didn't want a civil war, if he didn't want a political party that is engaged in constant infighting, I'm sorry, buddy, your dream is over. The right-wing press have kind of been loving this.
And his silence regarding the ongoing civil war within Reform UK. Speaking about an hour ago, the Reform leader had this to say.
When we found out one of our MPs was facing these accusations, without prejudging anything, we decided to appoint an independent KC to have a look at the situation ourselves. Since that moment, things have got a little bit out of control.
GB News have kind of been loving this. Like, they really get to feel like politics is happening for the far right in the UK, because, you know, not only do they now have a political party that has 5 MPs, but also they're kicking off against each other. Like, that sort of is in some ways the mark of a proper political party, right? And so all of this is going to continue to unfold, and at a point where it kind of does matter, because slightly before we went live this evening, Mike Amesbury, who was a Labour Party MP who was has been convicted of he sort of repeatedly punched a constituent. Some of you will have seen the footage, I'm sure, and had been suspended by the Labour Party. He has stepped down because he was convicted, and therefore there is going to be a by-election in Runcorn and Helmsby, and Reform would probably quite like to make a gain there. I think the majority is like 15,000 or something. 14,696. Which is chunky, but Reform will be hoping that they might be able to overturn that. The big question, though, and obviously, you know, this will continue for a long time. GB News will be loving it for a long time. Backs and forths will be happening. It's probably gonna do numbers for Rupert Low's income on X. I mean, it is interesting to see that quite a few right-wing influencers are kind of having Rupert Low's back here. Partly, one might assume, because Nigel Farage has been trying to play it safe, whereas Rupert Low is kind of going more for the Donald Trump thing of, like, you know, no enemies to the right, let's go for this, let's, you know, just really amp up the rhetoric, deport them all, planes leaving every hour, all of that kind of thing. Where Nigel Farage has begun to be a bit more cautious. You know, he was interviewed the other day and someone said, do you want to deport hundreds of thousands of people? And he said, well, that's not a political possibility at the moment. And they said, would you want to deport hundreds of thousands of people if it was a possibility? And Nigel Farage kind of said, no, I don't want to do that. That's not my intention. However, for a lot of right-wing influencers in the UK, and particularly kind of very Americanized right-wing influencers who are in a media bubble which is quite sort of anglophonic in that sense of being a little like having a lot of imported ideas from the US, they do want the Reform Party to really go for it with the kind of far-right, deport them all populism. And so all of this will continue to play out. The big question, though, and we will possibly find out this when we get to this by-election, is, does any of this matter? as I said earlier, you know, everyone in the country knows who Nigel Farage is. They broadly think of the Reform Party as Nigel Farage's political party and as a kind of broad-based movement. Very few people know who Rupert Low is. Some know who Lee Anderson is. If you're quite engaged, you probably know who Richard Tice is. There's one more of them who I can't remember. What's he called again? James McMurdoch. No one has a bloody clue who James McMurdoch is. The appeal of the Reform Party isn't really its specific MPs. It's rarely its particular candidates in any other places, in a way that for the Lib Dems, for the Labour Party, like a local candidate being someone that people have heard of and that has like volunteered to do good things around and has a bit of a big name on in the city or whatever, is often a factor. For Reform, a lot of the appeal is Nigel Farage, and then it's kind of this broadly anti-establishment, Trumpy kind of populism. And so there's every chance that a lot of voters who are likely to vote for Reform anyway aren't going to have followed this story, or quite frankly, don't really care about an argument between two MPs and will vote for them anyway. And that's the thing that I'm really kind of interested to see when we do get to that by-election. Apparently, while we have been on air today, Elon Musk has apparently, according to the FT, and I can only see the headline here, expressed support for a rival to Reform UK as feud in Farage's party intensifies. Amazing that this has happened whilst we've been live. It says allies of tech billionaire say he has signalled he would back an alternative to Nigel Farage's populist party. Amazing. Okay, so there is the possibility that we are about to have a by-election, and even potentially for the general election which follows in 2029, potentially have a situation where not only would we have Reform, we would have the Conservative Party, who are also kind of gunning for the Reform Party's voters, probably with a new leader, because Kemi Badenoch basically doesn't exist. We would then have the Labour Party also kind of gunning for a lot of Reform's voters, and then another Reform competitor party running to the right. Incredible.